When a grandmaster invited a simple woman to play chess as a joke, he expected easy entertainment for his wealthy audience. But what happened next didn't just silence the room. It shattered everything he believed about superiority, respect, and the true spirit of the game. The crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across the marble floor as Margaret methodically cleaned each chess piece on the ornate tables. She was young, perhaps in her early 20s, with fair skin and golden blonde hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Her modest navy uniform was pressed and clean, but clearly inexpensive, the kind worn by service staff everywhere. Yet there was something in her quiet movements, a natural grace that made her seem to glide between the tables. That suggested depths the wealthy patrons never bothered to notice. Her cloth moved carefully over the ivory-carved knights and queens, pieces worth more than most people's cars. Each time she touched them, a memory flickered. Her grandmother's Tanny Brooklyn apartment, the worn plastic chess set from the corner drugstore, pieces that had lost their felt bottoms years ago, but never lost their magic. The exclusive Manhattan Chess Club hummed with its usual evening activity, wealthy patrons discussing strategy over expensive wine, their voices echoing through the high-ceiling room with the kind of confidence that only money could buy. Margaret wiped down the table where greatness was performed, but never invited to sit. She had been invisible here for 3 years now, watching these people treat chess like a status symbol, flaunting their ratings and memberships like designer jewelry. They'd drop names of famous players that they'd met, brag about expensive private coaching sessions, and look down on anyone who didn't belong to their elite circle. "Careful with that board," one member had once told her. "It's worth more than your monthly salary." Margaret had simply nodded and continued cleaning, knowing that the beauty of chess had nothing to do with the price of the pieces. Her grandmother had taught her that chess was about the mind, not the money, about strategy, patience, and respect for your opponent. But this place had turned her beloved game into something ugly. That's exactly why she'd taken this job. Every day she watched these people mock everything she held sacred about chess. They'd analyze games they barely understood, criticize moves made by masters far better than themselves, and worst of all, they'd dismiss anyone who didn't fit their narrow definition of who deserved to play. "The help shouldn't even touch the pieces," she'd overheard a woman saying once. "They might not understand how delicate they are." Margaret had bitten her tongue that day, just like every other day. But deep down, a fire burned. She knew more about chess strategy than most people in this room would ever dream of knowing. She'd studied the game religiously, not for trophies or ratings, but because she genuinely loved the pure art of it. Tonight felt different somehow. The air was thick with anticipation as members prepared for their monthly charity exhibition. It was always the same routine. Wealthy donors would gather to watch demonstrations and feel good about their tax-deductible contributions. As Margaret arranged chairs around the main demonstration table, she noticed him strutting across the room like he owned the place. Richard Cromwell, the club's pride and joy, a genuine grandmaster who'd moved here from Europe 2 years ago and immediately became their celebrity trophy. Richard was everything Margaret despised about the modern chess world: arrogant, condescending, and obsessed with his own reputation. She'd watched him humiliate weaker players for sport, making jokes about their moves while an audience of sycophants laughed along. A memory surfaced in Richard's mind as he surveyed the room. His own chess teacher from childhood, a stern man who'd told him that intelligence was inherited, that some people were simply born superior. Richard had built his entire identity around that belief, using chess as proof of his natural gifts. "Chess is about intelligence," he'd once declared during a lecture. "Some people simply aren't born with the mental capacity to truly understand this game. It's not their fault. Really, it's just nature." The way he said it, with that smug smile and those cold eyes, had made Margaret's stomach turn. But she'd kept scrubbing the floor, invisible as always. Tonight, Richard wore his usual expensive suit and that insufferable grin that suggested he was about to entertain himself at someone else's expense. Little did he know that his favorite game was about to teach him a lesson in humility that no amount of money could buy. The charity event was in full swing when Richard decided it was time for his favorite pastime. Public humiliation disguised as entertainment. The donors had already contributed generously, wine was flowing freely, and the atmosphere was ripe for what he considered an educational demonstration. "Ladies and gentlemen, Richard announced, his voice cutting through the chatter like a knife. "Tonight, I thought we might have a little fun with an impromptu lesson about the levels of chess mastery." The crowd gathered around, their faces lighting up with anticipation. They loved watching Richard in action, especially when he was about to demonstrate his superiority over some unsuspecting victim. Margaret continued cleaning nearby tables, trying to remain invisible. But something in Richard's tone made her pause. She'd learned to recognize that particular inflection. One night, it meant someone was about to be humiliated for the crowd's amusement. "You see," Richard continued, gesturing grandly, "there are natural hierarchies in chess, just as there are in life. Some people are born to be masters. Others—" He let his eyes scan the room theatrically. "Well, others serve different purposes." His gaze landed on Margaret, and that cruel smile spread across his face like oil on water. "You there," he called out, pointing directly at her. "Yes, you, the cleaning lady. What's your name?" Every head in the room turned toward Margaret. She felt their stares like pinpricks on her skin, some dismissive, others surprised by her quiet composure under pressure. Her fair complexion showed the slightest flush, but she kept her expression neutral, her natural dignity shining through despite the uncomfortable attention. "Margaret, sir. Margaret Perfect. Tell me, Margaret, do you know how to play chess?" The question hung in the air like a trap waiting to spring. Margaret could feel the crowd's amusement building. They were already enjoying the setup for whatever humiliation Richard had planned. "I know the rules, sir," she replied quietly, her voice carrying a calm that belied the storm brewing beneath. Richard clapped his hands together with exaggerated delight. "Wonderful, ladies and gentlemen. What do you say we give Margaret here a chance to play against a real grandmaster just for fun?" "Of course." The crowd murmured their approval, some already chuckling at the absurdity of the suggestion. A few whispered comments reached Margaret's ears. "This should be quick. Poor thing doesn't know what she's getting into." Margaret felt something shift inside her. She didn't play to prove them wrong. She played because chess deserved better than this. The game her grandmother had taught her with such reverence, such love. It deserved dignity. "Oh, I couldn't, sir," Margaret protested, playing her part perfectly. "I'm working, and I'm sure you have more important—" "Nonsense," Richard interrupted, clearly relishing the moment. "Consider it part of tonight's entertainment. Besides, it'll be educational for everyone here to see the difference between natural talent and, well, enthusiasm." The crowd laughed at his thinly veiled insult. Richard gestured toward the ornate demonstration table in the center of the room, its expensive pieces gleaming under the chandelier light. "Come now, don't be shy. I promise I'll go easy on you. We'll make it quick. I wouldn't want to keep you from your duties too long." More laughter rippled through the crowd. Margaret looked around at their expectant faces, at their smug expressions of anticipated entertainment. These people saw her as nothing more than decoration, a young, pretty face to serve their needs and provide occasional amusement. The contrast couldn't have been starker. Her simple uniform among their designer clothes, her youth among their established wealth, her quiet grace among their loud arrogance. That familiar fire began to burn in her chest. "All right, sir," she said, setting down her cleaning supplies. "If you insist." The ornate chess set gleamed under the crystal chandelier as Margaret took her seat across from Richard. Despite her simple appearance, her blonde hair catching the light, her modest uniform a stark contrast to the opulent surroundings, there was an unmistakable poise in the way she settled into her chair. The expensive ivory pieces felt cold and heavy in her hands, the same pieces she'd polished earlier that evening. For a moment she hesitated, not from fear, but from the weight of memory. These weren't just game pieces. They were symbols of everything this place represented. But chess was chess, regardless of whether the pieces were carved from ivory or molded from plastic. Now then, Richard announced to his captive audience, let's begin with a simple lesson in opening theory. Margaret, do you know what an opening is? When you start the game, she replied simply, her voice betraying none of the knowledge burning beneath the surface. Exactly, Richard beamed condescendingly. Very good. Now, I'll show everyone how a master approaches the opening compared to, well, someone without formal training. He gestured dramatically at the board. The key to chess mastery lies in understanding principles that take years to develop. Pattern recognition, positional understanding, tactical awareness. These aren't things you can simply pick up by watching. The crowd nodded sagely, as if they themselves possessed such deep understanding. Several members positioned themselves for better views, their phones already out to capture what they assumed would be a quick and amusing demolition. Ladies first, Richard said with exaggerated chivalry, indicating that Margaret should play white. Margaret moved her king's pawn 2 squares forward, e4, a classical choice, but Richard immediately pounced on the opportunity to lecture. Ah, yes, the most basic of openings, king's pawn to e4, very predictable. You see everyone. He addressed the crowd while moving his own pawn to e5. Beginners always start with the most obvious moves. They haven't developed the sophistication to understand the subtleties of modern opening theory. Margaret quietly developed her knight to f3, attacking Richard's pawn. Standard, solid, unremarkable, exactly what everyone expected from someone of her supposed level. Richard responded with knight to c6, then launched into another mini-lecture. Notice how I'm developing with tempo, maintaining central control while preparing for more complex strategic ideas. This is the difference between playing moves and understanding chess. The early moves continued in textbook fashion. Margaret played bishop to b5, the Ruy Lopez opening. It was classical, well-known, the kind of opening any beginner might stumble into by accident. Oh my, Richard chuckled. She's accidentally fallen into the Ruy Lopez. How quaint. Of course, knowing the first few moves of an opening is quite different from understanding its deeper strategic concepts. But something nagged at the back of Richard's mind as the game progressed. Margaret's moves, while appearing simple, were precisely correct. Not just playable, correct. Her pieces developed naturally. Her pawn structure remained sound, and she hadn't made a single inaccuracy. He played to perform. She played to preserve. Probably just beginner's luck, he told himself. After all, the early moves of most openings were fairly straightforward. The real test would come in the middle game when tactical complications arose and positional understanding became crucial. Notice her posture, he whispered conspiratorially to the nearby spectators. Completely tense. She has no idea what's coming. But if Richard had looked more carefully, he might have noticed that Margaret's apparent tension wasn't from nervousness. It was from restraint. By move 15, Richard's condescending commentary had shifted from amused to puzzled. Every single one of Margaret's moves was not just correct. They were the kind of precise, principled decisions that came from deep understanding of positional chess. A childhood memory flashed through Richard's mind, standing before his first chess teacher, being told he was naturally gifted, that others simply couldn't compete with his inherited intelligence. He'd used that belief to justify every cruel comment, every dismissive gesture toward players he deemed inferior. Interesting, he murmured, studying the board more carefully than he'd intended. She's not making the mistakes I expected. The crowd began to sense something different in his tone. Where before he'd been jovial and dismissive, now there was a hint of genuine concentration creeping into his voice. Margaret castled kingside with quiet efficiency. The move was perfectly timed. Not too early, not too late. Her rook swung into the game along the f-file, and suddenly Richard realized his own king position wasn't as secure as he'd assumed. That's actually quite good, he admitted reluctantly, then quickly caught himself. Of course, even a broken clock is right twice a day. But luck doesn't explain 15 consecutive strong moves. Richard found himself actually thinking now, calculating variations he hadn't expected to need. This was supposed to be a 5-minute demolition job, not a real game. Margaret's next move created a subtle weakness in his pawn structure. Then she improved her piece coordination with surgical precision. Each move seemed simple on the surface, but beneath lay layers of strategic understanding that made Richard's chest tighten with growing unease. "She's setting traps," Dr. Patterson whispered to his neighbor. "Look at that rook placement. It's supporting 3 different attacking ideas." Richard felt sweat beginning to form on his forehead. The woman across from him wasn't just playing decent chess. She was outplaying him. Every exchange left him slightly worse. Every maneuver revealed new weaknesses in his position. Margaret placed her bishop on the long diagonal, and Richard suddenly saw the trap he'd been walking into. If he took her knight as planned, she had a devastating tactical shot that would win material. How had she seen that 5 moves ago? "Of course," Richard said, his voice slightly strained. "When you're playing against unpredictable opposition, you must always be careful not to underestimate tactical possibilities." The crowd was growing restless. They'd expected entertainment, but this was turning into an actual chess match. Several members whispered among themselves, clearly confused by the extended duration of what should have been a quick exhibition. "Is he having trouble?" one woman whispered to her husband. "She wasn't playing a game," someone murmured. "She was making a point." Richard heard the comments and felt heat rise in his cheeks. This was supposed to be his moment of triumph, his demonstration of natural superiority. Instead, he found himself genuinely struggling against a cleaning lady who shouldn't even know what a tactical shot was. Margaret sat quietly across from him, her expression unchanged. She wasn't gloating or showing off. She was simply playing chess. Beautiful chess, devastatingly precise chess. "She must have been studying," Richard muttered, more to himself than to the crowd. "Probably been watching games here, picking up bits and pieces." But deep down, he was beginning to realize that what he was witnessing wasn't copied knowledge or lucky guessing. This was pure chess understanding, the kind that couldn't be faked or accidentally stumbled upon. When Margaret's next move created a permanent weakness in his king position, one so subtle that most masters would miss it, but so damaging that it sealed the game's fate. Richard finally understood. He wasn't playing against a cleaning lady who happened to know chess. He was playing against a master. The room had fallen completely silent. What started as casual entertainment had transformed into something none of them had expected. A genuine chess battle where the supposed amateur was systematically dismantling the supposed expert. Richard stared at the board, beads of sweat forming on his forehead as he realized the full scope of his predicament. Margaret had been methodically outplaying him for the past 10 moves, and now the position was becoming critical. Every piece she'd moved served multiple purposes. Every pawn push created hidden threats. This wasn't luck or copying. This was artistry. Pure, devastating artistry. "She's quite good for someone who just knows the rules," whispered Dr. Patterson, his voice filled with growing amazement. "Richard looks concerned." Richard was more than concerned. He was genuinely fighting for his life on the chessboard. The woman across from him had revealed herself to be a player of extraordinary depth. Someone who understood chess on a level that challenged everything he believed about talent and superiority. The position reached its crescendo when Margaret lifted her queen. The entire room held its breath. Richard prayed she wouldn't see the devastating combination that was lurking in the position like a coiled serpent. Surely no one could spot something so complex, so deeply hidden. She hesitated, not because she doubted the move, but because she knew what came after that would change everything. Margaret played queen to h2 check. The move hit the board with the force of a thunderclap. Richard's king was suddenly in check. But more than that, he could see the entire combination unfolding before his eyes like a nightmare. If he moved his king to f1, she had queen to h1 check, followed by unavoidable checkmate. If he blocked with his knight, she would capture it and still have mate in 3 moves. "No," he whispered, studying the board desperately. "That's not. She can't have." But she had. The combination was flawless, unstoppable, brilliant. Richard had walked directly into a mating net so sophisticated that even he hadn't seen it coming until it was too late. The spectators began to understand what was happening. Dr. Patterson's jaw dropped as he traced the forcing sequence. That's, that's actually brilliant, he said in disbelief. She's found a forced mate. That's master-level calculation. Richard tried one last desperate defense, moving his king to G1, but Margaret's response was immediate and merciless. Queen to H1 check, and king to G2 was forced. Then queen to G1 check drove his king back into the web. When the dust settled, she would capture his queen with check and leave him completely lost. I resign, Richard said quietly, his voice barely audible. The words hung in the air like smoke. No one moved. No one spoke. The great Richard Cromwell, their prized grandmaster, their symbol of intellectual superiority, had just been thoroughly defeated by the woman they paid to clean their floors. Margaret reached across the board and offered her hand. As she did, her fingers briefly touched the ivory queen that had delivered checkmate, the same piece she'd polished just hours earlier. The symbolism wasn't lost on her. "Good game, May," she said simply. As Richard shook her hand, his face burning with embarrassment and confusion, he sat in stunned introspection. All his beliefs about natural talent, inherited intelligence, social hierarchies, everything was crumbling. "All these years," whispered, "I thought I was teaching, but tonight, I was the student." The silence in the room was deafening. Their entire worldview had just been turned upside down by a quiet woman in a simple uniform who understood chess better than any of them ever would. They had invited her to be a joke. She came to remind them why chess was ever respected. The silence stretched on until finally Dr. Patterson found his voice. "That was extraordinary chess. Where did you learn to play like that?" Margaret stood up slowly, her expression remaining calm despite the magnitude of what had just occurred. "I've always loved the game," she said simply. "My grandmother taught me when I was little." "But that combination," Richard stammered, still trying to process his defeat. "The way you built that position, that's master-level understanding." For the first time that evening, Margaret's expression softened slightly. "Chess isn't about money or status or fancy clubs," she said quietly. "It's about the beauty of the game itself, the way pieces work together, the elegant solutions hiding in complex positions." She gestured around the opulent room. "I work here because I love being around chess, even though I despise what this place represents. You've all turned something pure and beautiful into a tool for feeling superior to others." Richard felt the weight of her words. Every cruel comment he'd made, every time he'd dismissed someone as not chess material, every moment he'd used his skill to humiliate rather than teach, it all came flooding back. "I thought chess was about proving you're better than other people," he admitted, his voice small. "But watching you play, you weren't trying to embarrass me. You were just playing beautifully." Margaret nodded. "Chess teaches us humility if we let it. Every game is a chance to learn something new, regardless of who you're playing against." The crowd remained stunned, their preconceptions shattered. Some looked ashamed, others simply bewildered by what they'd witnessed. "Maybe," Richard said quietly, "you could teach me something about the real spirit of chess sometime." Margaret smiled for the first time that evening. "I'd like that," she said. "After all, we're never too old to learn." She paused at the door, looking back one final time at the ivory chess set gleaming under the chandeliers. "Even a pawn," she said softly, "when it reaches the end, becomes something they never expected." Stories like Margaret's remind us that wisdom and talent often hide in the most unexpected places. The next time you meet someone new, remember, you might be standing before a master whose brilliance you've never noticed. Sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the quietest voices.